Manner of articulation describes the articulatory action and degree of constriction used in producing consonants. Stops involve an interruption of the airstream. Flaps are like stops, but there's a very rapid ballistic tongue movement that causes a minimal interruption. Nasals are much like stops in a closure in the oral cavity, but airflow continues through the nasal cavity. Fricatives have a narrow channel rather than a closure that creates turbulent noise. Affricates combine a stop closure with a release into a fricative constriction with a narrow channel. Liquids have a more vowel-like articulation with some sort of constriction that produces distinct acoustic results. Glides are very vowel-like, but more brief and transitional. The production of stops includes closure of the vocal tract at the place of articulation that stops airflow. Intraoral air pressure then builds up behind that closure, which will usually cause vocal fold vibration to cease, regardless of whether the larynx is set up for phonation to happen or not. The closure is then released, producing a stop burst, and sometimes then these sounds are referred to as plosive consonants. If the vocal folds are adducted, voicing will resume soon after the release of the stop, or it may be delayed for voiceless stops as a cue to the fact that the speech sound is voiceless. Common allophones of stops include aspiration for stops in initial position, as in tame, and unreleased stops when they are in final position, as in wait. The flap or tap, in the case of English, is alveolar. It is an allophone of T and D that's found in intervocalic position, especially after a stressed syllable. Depending on dialect, there may be a difference between flaps that come from words spelled with T and flaps that come from words that are spelled with Ds. I believe in my dialect there is no noticeable difference, so I have two words, writer and writer, one spelled with a T and one spelled with a D, that seem the same to me. Note that when listening to speech production, stops that are followed by homorganic nasals or by laterals may not be flapped, even though they may sound like flaps. Their release will occur when airflow for the nasal or the lateral begins. So for example, in something like hidden or adenoids or bottle or bedlam, you may not hear much of a traditional stop, but it wouldn't make any sense for that sound to be a flap, because you would then just have to go back and make a closure for that nasal sound or for that lateral. Nasal consonants involve closure of the vocal tract at the place of articulation that stops airflow through the oral cavity, just like a stop or a plosive. However, the velum is lowered, which opens the velopharyngeal port for airflow to continue through the nasal cavity. In English, velum lowering for coda nasals occurs early during the preceding vowel, which adds a feature of nasalization to those vowels. That can be transcribed with a tilde diacritic above the vowel. So there's a difference in vowel quality between note and tone, where in tone the vowel is nasalized. Fricative consonants are produced by a narrow constriction at the place of articulation, this constriction being narrow enough to create turbulence in the airstream that generates a noise source. The loudest of the fricatives, the alveolar s, z, and the palatal sh, zh, are called strident fricatives or sibilants. In this case, the airstream is aimed at the teeth to create additional turbulence or noise. The affricate consonants involve production with a sound like a stop, which is then released into the articulation of a palatal fricative, giving a loud burst of sibilant fricative noise. English has a variety of other clusters that are somewhat like affricates when a stop is followed by a fricative, as in the case of words like laps, ribs, axe, bugs, cats, words. Liquid consonants come in two distinct types in English. The L sound is called a lateral consonant because the tip of the tongue makes contact at the alveolar ridge while the sides of the tongue are lowered so that the airstream is not blocked and airflow continues around the sides of the tongue. The L consonant in English has two pretty different allophones. In onset position, we get what's called a light L, what you might think of as your traditional L sound. In coda position, you find a dark L that's referred to as velarized because the tongue body is pulled back considerably in the region of the velum, much like it is for a vowel. So for velarized L's with the ol-like sound to them, they have much more of a vowel and L combination sound, perhaps somewhat similar to our rhotic vowel like The other liquid consonant is the rhotic consonant. There's a wide variety of productions in the r consonant sound. The acoustic effects that a rhotic sound gives can be created by constrictions at the pharynx, the palate, and the lips, and many speakers use all three of these constriction regions. In addition, the palatal constriction can be made in different ways. One version, referred to as retroflexed, has the tongue tip curled up so that the back of the tongue nears the palate. The palatal constriction can also be made with the tongue tip down and the tongue blade relatively up, or known as a bunched articulation. The glide consonants include the palatal glide y, which is very similar to an E vowel. If you consider saying something like hear ye, and consider your articulation when you do that, there's very little movement for ye, as opposed to something like you, where the tongue body must be pulled back quite a bit. The ya is also sometimes found with an diphthong-like quality, combining with the following vowel in an onset cluster, so in something like fuse. The w is very similar to an oo vowel, so again, if you say something like woohoo, there's very little movement of the tongue compared to something like we, where the tongue has to move forward considerably to transition from the w to the e. The w is somewhat distinct in that it has constriction at the velum and at the lips, so we describe it with this composite labio-velar place of articulation.